Hi everybody, my name's Amanda, and this is my story. You've probably realized already that I work as a flight attendant. Did you know that there are places on planes that no one knows about? Oh, and by the way, you can hide in them too. Do you want to know where you can find them? Go ahead, listen to my story. It all began after I graduated from a flight attendant school and got a job at one of the biggest airlines in the country. They showed me where I'd be working on a huge Boeing and introduced me to the crew. I began to fly to different countries and help passengers feel comfortable during the flights. I liked my job. The other flight attendants were very kind to me, and the pilot in command even allowed me to sit in his seat. The only unpleasant person in the crew was the co-pilot, Mr. Blackheart. I didn't like him straight away. The other flight attendants didn't like him either. There were rumors that he was sexually harassing girls. It happened to me once as well. During one of the flights, he asked me to take a photo with him, and I couldn't refuse out of politeness. He took out his phone, put an arm around me, and as he was taking the picture, he suddenly kissed me. I pushed Mr. Blackheart away, and I told him not to do it again. But Mr. Blackheart laughed and replied,
"Why are you acting coy? Don't you want a boyfriend who's a real Boeing pilot?"
I said I already had a boyfriend, Ben, and we were serious. Mr. Blackheart only smirked and left. After a while, he tried to hit on me a few more times, but I always turned him down. I even did it quite rudely the last time. "Get your filthy hands off me!" Mr. Blackheart glared at me and said,
"You're gonna regret this."
He was so nasty. Then, one day, I came back from a flight and went home. I lived with my boyfriend Ben in his apartment. I didn't have my own place. I hadn't seen Ben in 2 days, and I missed him terribly. I wanted to hug him and drink a cocktail together. However, Ben greeted me very coldly. What had happened? I didn't understand anything. But then, my boyfriend took out his phone and showed me a photo, and it was a picture of Mr. Blackheart kissing me without any warning.
"What's this?"
asked Ben. I started to tell him about the co-pilot's harassment, but Ben interrupted and shouted,
"Stop lying to me! I know everything!"
He said he'd found the photo on Twitter. There was a detailed description of everything I'd been doing with the co-pilot during the flights. I tried to argue that it wasn't true, and that this was all Mr. Blackheart's way of taking revenge on me. But Ben wouldn't listen, and said everything was over between us. I couldn't believe my ears. Ben would really give me up that easily? That made me really angry. So I shouted to him, "Well, that's just great! If you're gonna be an idiot, I don't want you either." I quickly packed my things and I left. That night, I was walking through the city and crying. Not because I felt hurt by what Mr. Blackheart had done, but from the anger caused by my boyfriend treating me that way. Ben knew I had nowhere to go. I had no friends or acquaintances in the city. My parents lived far away in another state, and now I had no home. That's why I went to the only place I could spend the night and clean myself up. I went to the plane. You might not know this, but there's a place in modern airlines that no one except the crew knows about. I'm talking about a small flight attendant lounge located above the business class cabin. You can lock yourself in there, and no one would find you. It was in that lounge that I settled in. I unpacked my things, washed my face, and started to think, what should I do next? With those thoughts in my mind, I fell asleep. The next day, I cleaned myself up, snuck out of the lounge, and I got to work. None of the crew realized that I'd slept on the plane. While preparing for the flight, I met Mr. Blackheart. He asked sarcastically,
"Well, how are you doing?"
I didn't want him to know about my breakup with Ben. So, I smiled cheerfully and replied that I was doing just fine. I wouldn't give him the joy of feeling like a winner. I would be fine. I was sure of it. And that's how I started living on a plane. I worked during the day, and in the evening, when the entire team went home, I would sneak into the flight attendant lounge. No one knew about my secret life. I had no idea how long it would last until something happened. One day, after another routine flight, when all the passengers had gotten out, I was cleaning the cabin up and suddenly saw a small bag left on one of the seats. It happens sometimes. Passengers forget their things on the plane, so it wasn't really strange. I just took the bag and I handed it over to airport administration. Out of pure curiosity, I looked into it, and I was stunned. The bag was full of money. There must have been $100,000 in there, at least. Who would forget such a huge sum on the plane? It was weird, and I decided not to hand the bag over just yet. I'd return it to the owner myself when they showed up. An hour passed, then 2, but the owner of the bag never showed up. Didn't anyone want the money they'd lost? Once a whole day had passed, I decided to find the owner of the bag myself. I found out the data of the passenger who'd been sitting in the seat where he found the money. He lived in the city, so I took a taxi and went to his place. An elderly man opened the door. I asked, "Mr. Hashimoto, you flew in just yesterday, right? You were in seat 7B, weren't you?" The man nodded. He was surprised to see me. I asked him if he'd lost anything, and I showed him the bag. However, Mr. Hashimoto said the bag was not his, and he hadn't forgotten anything on the plane. I wasn't expecting that. Whose was it then? I drove back to the plane, lost in thought. The bag of money was lying in front of me in the lounge. I was looking at it, and I didn't know what to do next. Suddenly, I heard voices in the cabin. Strange, I thought. There were no flights planned that day. Who could it be? I slipped out of my secret hideout and peeked into the business class cabin. Between the rows where I'd found the bag was Mr. Blackheart, and next to him were some dangerous-looking men. I began to eavesdrop. The men were saying that they'd left the money for Mr. Blackheart and were demanding the job to be done. The co-pilot replied that he hadn't found any money in the cabin, but the men wouldn't listen to his excuses and kept demanding that he do something for them. That's when I understood everything. Mr. Blackheart had been doing something illegal, probably smuggling something in his luggage across the border. After all, they didn't check pilot's baggage, and those people had paid him for it, and the money I had found had been meant for him. Wow! It turned out that nasty Mr. Blackheart wasn't just harassing girls, but also doing something extremely serious. My first instinct was to tell the police, but then I realized I'd have to return the money. Instead, I could get revenge on Mr. Blackheart. So I decided not to tell anyone, and I kept the money. It was such a relief. I'd punished the one who had hurt me, and I got a nice bonus out of it as well. I didn't care what would happen to Mr. Blackheart. I was so happy that I went shopping at once. I went to the coolest boutiques, and I spent a ton of money. I bought the most beautiful dress from a new collection, awesome shoes, beautiful jewelry, and a bunch of cosmetics. Oh yeah, I spent all that money on myself and looked really good doing it. In the middle of my shopping spree, my phone rang. It was my ex-boyfriend. I was surprised and I answered the phone, but I hadn't been prepared for what I heard. Ben was saying that he missed me very much. He was begging for my forgiveness and for me to come back. It was so nice to hear that. Truly, this day was full of surprises. I told Ben that I forgave him and I asked him to come get me. In a great mood, I ran to the plane to collect my things. The cabin was empty and I went up to the lounge humming a happy song. I was looking forward to going home to my boyfriend soon and living a quiet life again. Suddenly, I saw Mr. Blackheart. He was sitting on the bed in the flight attendant lounge, glaring at me. What was going on? I asked him what he thought he was doing there. Mr. Blackheart said he knew everything. He'd been following me and had found out that I'd been living on the plane for several days, and that's how he knew I'd taken the bag. I had no choice but to admit that it had been me. Then, the co-pilot started demanding that I return all the money. I got scared. I said I couldn't do it because I'd already spent it all. Mr. Blackheart looked me up and down and said,
"Then give me everything you've bought with my money."
I felt so afraid at that moment. What would he do to me if I refused? And I took off all my jewelry, clothes, and the expensive dress. I wanted him to let me go as soon as possible. And then, when I was left standing in front of him in just my underwear, something happened that I had not been expecting at all. I saw Ben standing at the entrance, looking at us with the angriest eyes. He found me naked with Mr. Blackheart in a secret room. I realized immediately that there was no excuse. And that's my whole story. Ben left me alone. Mr. Blackheart got what he wanted, and I was left with absolutely nothing. The next day, the company found out that I'd been secretly living on the plane, and they fired me. That's how I ended up without a boyfriend, a job, or any money. I couldn't even afford a plane ticket to my parents' city. And that's why I'm asking you, please, share this story. Maybe Ben will see it and realize that I'm actually innocent. Please, subscribe to the channel. I really need your help.